I was in the kitchen, humming softly to myself as the evening shadows grew longer outside. The soft clatter of utensils filled the air as I prepared dinner. The aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh herbs made the house feel warm and inviting. I loved moments like these. Simple, ordinary, but full of life. Soon I heard Edward's familiar footsteps on the porch. The creak of the front door followed, and I smiled to myself. He was home. "Hey, love," I called out, peeking around the corner. He set his bag down by the door, stretching his broad shoulders. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his eyes gleamed with that energy he always had after a busy day. "Hey," he said with a grin. "Smells amazing in here." "How was your day?" I asked, wiping my hands on a dish towel as he stepped into the kitchen. "Good, really good," Edward said, pulling out a chair at the table. "The store was packed. Lots of customers today. Oh, and this woman came in with some antique things she wants to sell. I told her to bring them by here tomorrow so you could take a look too. Thought you might like to help decide what to buy." I smiled at his thoughtfulness. "That sounds fun. It'll be nice to see what she has." "Yeah," Edward said, leaning back in his chair. "She seemed to have some interesting stuff." "How much did you make today?" I asked playfully, raising an eyebrow. Edward chuckled. "Pretty good, actually. Around $100. I grinned. "Not bad, Mr. Wolf." He laughed and stood, brushing past me on his way to the bathroom. "I'm starving, but I need a shower first." As the sound of running water filled the house, I finished setting the table, smoothing the cloth and arranging the plates just so. When Edward came back out, his hair damp and his towel slung low around his waist, I couldn't help but tease him. "Now that," I said with a mischievous smile, "is a sight for sore eyes." He laughed, walking over to me, and I leaned in close. His kiss was warm, his scent fresh from the shower. For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. Then Edward pulled back with a sheepish grin. "I really am starving, Jess." I laughed, shaking my head. "Fine. Food first." We sat down to eat, the clink of silverware mixing with the occasional laugh as we talked about our day. The warmth of his presence filled the room, making the house feel even cozier. After dinner, Edward headed to bed while I stayed behind to clean up. By the time I was done, the house was quiet. I turned off the lights and locked the doors, the soft click echoing in the stillness. When I reached our bedroom, I unbuttoned my shirt, hoping to surprise Edward with a playful entrance. But as soon as I stepped inside, I realized he was already fast asleep. I sighed, buttoning my shirt back up as I sat beside him. "Edward?" I whispered, but he didn't stir. Smiling to myself, I slid under the covers, listening to his steady breathing until sleep claimed me too. The next morning, I woke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Edward was already up, standing by the kitchen counter with 2 steaming mugs. "Good morning," he said, handing me a cup. I smiled, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Morning. You're up early." "That woman is coming in about 30 minutes, he said. I sipped my coffee, savoring the rich taste. "I'll be ready in 25. Edward had already showered and dressed by the time I headed to the bathroom. I realized I'd forgotten my towel on purpose, a small smile playing on my lips. "Edward," I called. "I forgot my towel." He appeared at the door, towel in hand, and when I grabbed his arm, I pulled him into the bathroom with me. He laughed softly, but before we could get carried away, a knock at the door interrupted us. "That'll be her," Edward said, quickly stepping out to get dressed. I hurried to wrap myself in the towel, dashing to our room to change. By the time I joined Edward in the living room, the woman, elegant and poised, with a confident air, was standing by the door. "Good morning," she said with a warm smile. I'm Noza. Edward welcomed her in, and we all gathered around as she began unpacking her collection of antiques. There was something mesmerizing about the items she pulled out. A delicate mirror with ornate carvings, an old music box that still played a haunting melody, a regal-looking sword, and more. One piece caught my eye, a small, intricately designed box tucked among the other items. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to it. Noza hesitated. "I'm not sure. I found it in an old storeroom years ago. It's beautiful, isn't it?" I nodded, my fingers brushing the smooth surface. There was something about the box that felt different. Edward returned with coffee, and we sat down to discuss what to buy. The box stayed in my mind, its delicate craftsmanship almost whispering secrets. In the end, we purchased several items, including the mysterious box. Noza left with a smile, pleased with the deal, and Edward and I were left with a new treasure to uncover. The morning sunlight poured into the kitchen as Edward and I sat at the table, staring at the peculiar box. The words Halgala box were etched into its surface in faded, ornate letters. It felt like it carried a weight far beyond its small size. Edward opened it carefully, revealing an old music box, a small shroud covered in Latin writing and strange symbols, and a tiny key. I picked up the key, inspecting it curiously. The music box had a keyhole that seemed to be waiting for it. "Should we try it?" I asked, glancing at Edward. He shrugged. "Why not? It's just a music box." Sliding the key in, I turned it gently. At first, nothing happened, but then, with a soft click, a strange, smoky fog seeped out. It swirled around us, almost alive, and a haunting melody began to play. A song in Latin, eerie and unfamiliar, like it came from a different time. The tune sent a shiver through me. "That's unsettling," I murmured, watching the fog slowly fade. Edward looked at me and grinned. "Well, unsettling or not, this thing might be worth a fortune. Someone will want it for the mystery alone." I nodded, still feeling uneasy. "Sell it for a good price. It's old, and it might even have historical value." Edward packed the box with care, along with the other antiques we'd purchased, and headed off to the store. I stayed back, tidying up and preparing lunch. As I chopped vegetables, I suddenly heard a rustling sound outside. It wasn't the usual noise of leaves or small animals. It was heavier, like something moving deliberately through the woods. I set down the knife and peered out the window, but whatever had been there was already gone. I tried to shake off the feeling. "It's nothing," I told myself, turning back to the cutting board. Still, the thought of that Halgala box lingered in my mind. When Edward returned later that afternoon, I greeted him at the door with a kiss. He was practically glowing with excitement. "You won't believe it," he said, holding my hands. "That Halgala box sold for $500. My eyes widened. $500? We bought it for $150. "I know. Huge profit." He laughed, his smile lighting up his whole face. We celebrated with a cozy dinner, sharing stories from the day. Afterward, Edward promised to wait for me in bed while I finished my routine. But by the time I slipped under the covers, he was already fast asleep. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment. The room was quiet except for his soft breathing. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a faint sound reached my ears. A melody. My stomach twisted as I recognized the weird Latin song from the Halgala box. I sat up, straining to hear it better. It was unmistakable. "Edward," I whispered, shaking him awake. He blinked at me groggily. "What is it?" "The music," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's that song from the box." He listened for a moment, then frowned. Jessica, I don't hear anything. Maybe you were dreaming? No, I'm sure of it, I insisted. But the music had stopped. Edward wrapped an arm around me. You've had a long day. Try to get some rest. He kissed me, and for the first time in a while, we shared a moment of closeness. It felt comforting, like we'd found each other again. The next morning, Edward surprised me with coffee in bed. He suggested we go out for lunch, and I eagerly agreed, happy to see him making an effort. But later, when he returned home unexpectedly early, he looked troubled. What happened? I asked, concern flooding my voice. Edward placed the Halgala box on the table. The man who bought it brought it back, he said. He didn't even want a refund. He just left it here and ran off. He seemed scared, Jess. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile. It's fine. We'll just sell it again. Maybe even for more this time. Edward nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. We went out for lunch as planned, enjoying the break from the strange events. But when we returned home, the Halgala box was sitting on the table, playing that same haunting melody. I rushed over and stopped it. Edward, I'm starting to think this thing is more trouble than it's worth, he sighed. You're probably right. Let's sell it quickly and be done with it. That evening, Edward surprised me with a birthday celebration. Friends, both werewolf and human, filled the house with laughter and cheer. As I mingled, I noticed my friend Anna admiring the Halgala box. This is beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the intricate designs. Careful with that, I warned. It's unique. Anna laughed. Unique? Sounds like there's a story here. She opened the box and smiled. I wish this could make some of my romantic dreams come true. Anna, seriously, don't mess with it, I said, trying to sound casual but firm. She closed it and joined me on the dance floor, the moment passing quickly. Later, I realized Anna was missing. Concerned, I asked around, and someone mentioned she'd gone to the bathroom. When I went to check, I saw her through the slightly open door. She was kissing a man whose back was to me. His broad shoulders and posture looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. Anna noticed me and smiled. I turned and walked away, my mind racing. When she rejoined the party, I pulled her aside. Anna, who was that? I whispered. She frowned. What are you talking about? In the bathroom. I saw you with someone. Anna laughed lightly. Jessica, I was alone. Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you've had a little too much wine. I didn't believe her, but I let it go. After everyone left, I climbed into bed beside Edward, exhausted but restless. As I wrapped my arms around him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Not with Anna, not with the Halgala box, and not with the man I'd seen. The night wrapped around the house like a heavy blanket, quiet except for the soft breathing of Edward beside me. I had just settled into bed, pulling the comforter snug against my body, when I heard it again. That song, that haunting, eerie Latin melody. I froze. My eyes darted toward the foot of the bed, and there it was. The Halgala box. Its dark wood seemed to gleam faintly in the dim light spilling from the street lamp outside. What the? I whispered, sitting up. I reached for the box, stopping the music with trembling hands. My fingers brushed its cool surface, and a strange sensation prickled down my arms. Before I could even begin to process why the box was here, a faint whisper caught my attention. My heart skipped. It was coming from the bathroom. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the sound grew louder, clearer. It was a voice. Anna's voice. Anna? I murmured. The hairs on my neck stood up. Anna was at her home. This didn't make sense. I reached over to shake Edward awake. "Edward, listen." He stirred slightly, mumbling something about being too tired, and rolled over. Great. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet landing softly on the wooden floor. The cool surface sent a shiver up my spine as I moved cautiously toward the door. Grabbing the metal baseball bat Edward kept near the closet, I crept down the hall. The whispers grew louder with every step. Anna's voice was unmistakable, but it sounded off, like it was layered with something darker. I hesitated outside the bathroom, gripping the bat tightly. My pulse thudded in my ears as I swung the door open. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. The white tiles gleamed under the faint glow of the nightlight. The towels hung neatly, untouched. The whispers stopped. I let out a shaky breath and flipped the light switch, plunging the bathroom into darkness. As I turned to leave, something cold and strong grabbed me from behind. A gasp escaped my lips before everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my home anymore. The world around me was strange, eerie. I was in a forest, but it wasn't like any forest I'd seen before. The trees were twisted and dark, their branches reaching out like claws. Metallic dust swirled in the air, catching the faint glow of a sickly orange sky. I stood, brushing dirt off my arms, and scanned my surroundings. My breath hitched when a man appeared a few feet away. He wore a Gothic-style cloak, his sharp features illuminated by the faint light. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rising unease in my chest. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I am Diago." "Where am I?" I demanded, my fingers instinctively curling as I felt the heat of my transformation taking over. My body shifted, fur replacing skin, claws extending. I lunged at him in my werewolf form, but he vanished before I could reach him. "Impressive," his voice echoed. I spun around to see him reappear farther away, his movement unnaturally quick. "You're inside the Halgala box," he said, his tone calm, almost casual. "A place where wishes come true." I narrowed my eyes. "Wishes?" He nodded slightly. "Yes. 2 wishes, to be precise. What will it be?" "I want to go home," I said firmly. Diago smiled again, the kind of smile that made my stomach twist. "As you wish." A violent wind whipped through the forest, and I closed my eyes against the storm. When I opened them, I was back in my bed. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as I lay there, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. But the feeling lingered. It had been too vivid to dismiss. I turned to Edward, shaking him awake. "We need to sell that box, Edward. Today." He rubbed his eyes, groggy. "All right, Jess, we'll sell it." After breakfast, Edward left for the store, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I cleaned up, I couldn't stop thinking about Diago's words. 2 wishes. What if it hadn't been a dream? Could I really ask for anything? The idea was tempting. I imagined myself and Edward living a life of luxury, no more worrying about bills or struggling to make ends meet. Still, the memory of that strange forest and Diago's unsettling smile made me hesitate. That evening, Edward returned with a wide grin. "The box is sold," he said triumphantly. I tried to share in his happiness, but a small part of me felt a pang of regret. I'd missed my chance. We had dinner together, and for once Edward seemed more attentive. But later, as I got into bed, I saw that he had already fallen asleep. I sighed, frustrated, and turned to stare at the ceiling. Then I heard it. The Latin song. My body stiffened. I sat up and followed the sound to the living room. There it was. the Halgala box, sitting on the coffee table like it had never left. "How?" I whispered, stepping closer. The temptation was too strong to resist. If this box could truly grant wishes. I turned the key. The smoky fog swirled around me, and before I knew it, I was back in that strange forest. Diago was waiting for me. "I want to be rich," I said quickly, "and I want romance in my life." Diago's smile widened, and a storm erupted once more. When it cleared, I was back in my bed. It was like a dream. The next morning, Edward woke me with news that left me speechless. He had won a $1 million lottery. "I bought the ticket a few days ago, and we won," he exclaimed. "This changes everything, Jess." I smiled, though my thoughts were elsewhere. Had my wish really come true? Edward's excitement was contagious. He talked about starting a new business, expanding his antique store, and even dividing the money between us. "You can start your own bar, Jess," he said, his eyes full of pride. We celebrated with dinner at a fancy restaurant, and for the first time in a long while, Edward surprised me. He kissed me passionately as soon as we got home, and the night ended in a way I hadn't expected. For once, I felt like everything was falling into place. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Halgala box wasn't done with us yet. Edward's hotel business took off quickly, and I couldn't have been prouder. But it came with a cost. Most days I only saw him at night, and even then, it was brief. He'd be exhausted, and I'd be left wishing for more of the man I married. When my bar finally opened, Edward surprised me by showing up for the launch. He even stayed longer than I expected, clapping when I gave a little speech and raising a toast to my success. For a while, it felt like old times, but then his phone buzzed. His business partner, Hannah, needed him for something urgent. He apologized, kissed my forehead, and left. That night, after all the customers were gone, I watched my staff lock up before I shut the bar's doors myself. Driving home, I kept glancing at my phone, hoping Edward would call or text to say he'd be late. Nothing. When I got home, the silence felt louder than ever. Edward wasn't there. I tried to convince myself he was working late at the hotel, maybe even asleep by now. But deep down, I felt something wasn't right. I called him. No answer. Dinner from the bar sat in a box on the counter. I ate alone, trying to shake off the sinking feeling in my chest. I called him again, but it went straight to voicemail. Lying in bed that night, sleep evaded me. I reached for my phone once more, but I stopped myself. If he was busy, I didn't want to nag him. Still, I couldn't ignore the knot twisting in my stomach. When I finally drifted off, the dream came. I was back in that strange forest, the metallic dust swirling in the air. Diago stood before me, his face unusually somber. "You deserve better than Edward," he said, his voice low and heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. The clock on the nightstand glowed 3:00 a.m. I couldn't shake the dream, or the nagging feeling that it wasn't just a dream. Pulling on jeans and a hoodie, I grabbed my keys and headed to Edward's hotel. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I needed to see for myself. The night air was crisp, and the hotel loomed quietly in the darkness. Using the spare keys Edward had given me, I slipped inside and made my way down the hall. The place was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floor under my feet. Room by room, I searched. My hands trembled as I turned the key in each lock. Finally, I found him. Edward was in bed, fully clothed, sleeping beside Hannah. My breath hitched. There was another shadow in the bathroom, faint movement behind the frosted glass. A third person. I didn't say a word. I didn't wake him. I simply left. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. When Edward came home that morning, I greeted him with a kiss. "Spend the day with me," I said, my voice soft. "Just one day. No work, no calls, just us." He smiled, clearly relieved I wasn't angry about his absence. "Okay, Jess, just one day." We spent the day at the bar. I poured drinks while Edward chatted with the staff, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. When the music started, I pulled him to the dance floor. "Come on, don't be shy," I teased. He laughed but followed my lead. For a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the room. We swayed together, and I let myself pretend everything was fine. After closing up, we had dinner at a small table by the bar's window. I could see the city lights twinkling outside, but my focus stayed on Edward. When we got home, Edward said he needed to head back to the hotel. "Stay," I said, placing a hand on his arm. "Jess, I can't. There's too much. Just for tonight," I pleaded. "Please." He hesitated, then finally agreed. That night, we made love, but something in me had changed. My movements were mechanical, my expressions blank. Edward noticed but didn't say anything. "How much do you love me?" I asked afterward, my voice quiet. He turned to me, his eyes sincere. "You're the most important person in my life, Jess. I'd do anything for you." I smiled, a cruel, empty smile, and closed my eyes. The next morning, Edward left for work. This time I didn't kiss him goodbye. At the bar that evening, the usual buzz of chatter and music filled the air. Around 8 p.m., the door swung open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with sharp features and a confident stride. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his tailored shirt hinted at a broad chest and strong shoulders. He had an effortless charm, the kind that drew eyes from every corner of the room. Women giggled and whispered behind their drinks, and even some of the men couldn't help but glance his way. When he approached the counter, his smile was warm and disarming. "Are you the owner?" "I am," I replied, setting down the glass I'd been cleaning. "I'm Samuel," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I'd like to reserve this place tomorrow for a birthday party." I blinked, taken aback by his directness. "Oh, well, sure. Just fill out this form and we can set it up." He filled it out quickly, not even flinching when I told him the cost. $1,000 for the evening, I said. Samuel handed me his credit card. "That's fine." He paid in full and left with a casual wave, leaving behind a ripple of intrigue. As I locked up later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His presence lingered, like a melody you can't shake. When I got home, Edward wasn't there. I ate alone, the quiet wrapping around me like an unwelcome guest. For the first time in a long time, I didn't miss him. I woke up to the sharp buzz of my phone. Squinting, I grabbed it from the nightstand and swiped to answer. "Jessica?" The voice was smooth, unfamiliar, yet instantly intriguing. "Yes, who's this?" I replied, sitting up and pushing the stray strands of hair from my face. "It's Samuel," he said. "I was just calling to remind you about the bar reservation tonight." "Oh, yes. Don't worry, I remember. Everything will be ready," I assured him, still trying to shake off the morning grogginess. "Great. But I was thinking," he added with a hint of amusement. "We can't plan decorations over the phone. Why don't we discuss it over coffee? It's just work, after all." I hesitated. "Coffee?" "Come on, Jessica. It's nothing formal," he teased lightly. "I'll make it quick, I promise." Against my better judgment, I agreed. All right. Where should we meet? He named a small cafe just a few blocks away, and I found myself rushing to get ready. It wasn't that I wanted to impress him, but, well, maybe I did. The cafe was cozy, with soft music playing in the background, and the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the space. Samuel was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window. His presence was hard to miss. He looked even more striking than before. His dark blue coat fit perfectly over a crisp white shirt, and his ocean blue eyes seemed to draw in every ray of sunlight streaming through the glass. As I approached, he stood, took my hand, and kissed it gently. "Jessica," he said with a smile, his voice warm. "Samuel," I replied, trying to keep my composure. We sat, and he leaned forward, his gaze intent, but not overpowering. "So, tell me, how should we decorate tonight?" I suggested a few ideas: soft lighting, floral centerpieces, perhaps a small stage for speeches. As I spoke, he listened intently, nodding here and there, his smile never wavering. "You've got quite an eye for design," he complimented. "It's impressive." "Just experience," I said modestly. But his praise lingered. Before we parted, Samuel added, "You're obviously invited tonight, and you must wear something stunning. After all, you're the lady of the house." His playful smile made my cheeks warm, and I simply returned a polite smile. By mid-afternoon, I found myself rummaging through my wardrobe. My usual work attire wouldn't do. Samuel and his guests would undoubtedly be dressed to the nines, and as the owner, I couldn't look out of place. I finally settled on a deep red gown that I hadn't worn in years. The fabric hugged my figure perfectly, and the flowing hem added a touch of elegance. As I slipped it on and styled my hair, I felt different. Confident, maybe. When I arrived at the bar, the staff's reactions said it all. "Wow, Jessica," one of the bartenders exclaimed. "You look amazing." I smiled, brushing off their compliments, but inside, I was glowing. The decorations were already in place, and the bar looked stunning. Guests began arriving shortly after. A middle-aged woman approached me, her kind face framed by silver-streaked hair. "Excuse me," she said. "Is this Samuel's birthday party?" "Yes, it is," I replied warmly. "Please make yourself comfortable." By 7 p.m., the bar was packed, but there was no sign of Samuel. I considered calling him, but decided against it. He'd arrive when he was ready. Finally, at 7:30, the door opened, and there he was, commanding attention without trying. Samuel entered with a beautiful woman on his arm. She was tall and elegant, her sleek black dress shimmering under the lights. "Happy birthday!" the crowd cheered. I made my way over to him and smiled. "Happy birthday, Samuel." "Jessica," he said, his voice softer now. "Will you dance with me?" Before I could answer, the crowd began chanting, "Dance! Dance!" I hesitated, but eventually took his hand. The music shifted to something slow, and as we moved together, I felt an unfamiliar pull. Samuel's hand rested lightly on my back, guiding me effortlessly across the floor. For a moment, I let myself enjoy it. His confidence, his ease. It was intoxicating. But then my eyes flicked to the woman he'd arrived with. I wondered if she was his girlfriend. The thought made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. After the dance, I excused myself to the restroom. When I returned, Samuel was on the dance floor again, this time with the same woman. I felt a pang of something I didn't want to admit. Jealousy? No, that couldn't be it. As the song ended, Samuel approached me with the woman by his side. "Jessica," he said. "Meet my sister, Sophie." Relief washed over me, though I quickly masked it with a polite smile. The night went on, and I found myself laughing and chatting with Samuel and his friends. It had been so long since I'd let loose like this. The drinks flowed freely, and the hours slipped by in a haze of laughter and music. When the party ended, I realized I could barely stand. Samuel offered to take me home. "I'm fine," I protested weakly, but he shook his head. "I insist," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, disoriented. My dress was gone, replaced by a loose nightrobe. My heart skipped as I turned and saw Samuel lying beside me, shirtless, his toned chest rising and falling gently as he slept. What had happened? I adjusted the strap of my robe, which had slipped off my shoulder, and sat up. Before I could gather my thoughts, Samuel stirred and opened his eyes. "Good morning," he said, leaning over to kiss me. I pulled back, confused and embarrassed. "Why did you kiss me?" He frowned slightly. "Jessica, we made love last night. You were happy with me." His words hit me like a freight train. "What?" I whispered. "You don't remember?" he asked, his voice soft. He showed me faint red marks on his chest and arms. "You left these, Jessica." I stared, speechless. I couldn't remember any of it. "Samuel, this is wrong. I'm married." He reached for my hand, his touch warm. "I'm not the kind of man who uses someone for one night. I like you, Jessica. I care about you." I pulled my hand away, tears welling up. "Please leave." Samuel stood, his expression unreadable. "I'm here if you need me," he said before walking out. The rest of the day passed in a blur. At the bar, I tried to focus on work, but my mind was a storm of emotions. Guilt, anger, confusion. Samuel was there, sitting alone at a corner table. "I'm worried," he said when I approached. "I think you don't like me." I sighed. "You're attractive, Samuel, but I can't do this." "What if you're pregnant?" he asked suddenly. "What?" I stared at him, stunned. "It's just a thought," he said, his tone calm. "But if you are, I'll be here for you." I shook my head, overwhelmed. "Please, just leave." But instead, he followed me into my office, locking the door behind him. "Samuel," I began, but he silenced me with a look. His touch was gentle but insistent, and for a moment, I felt myself give in. I kissed him, the pull between us undeniable. But then, as suddenly as it began, he pulled away. "You have my number," he said. "Call me when you're ready." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my tangled emotions. Edward's name lit up on my phone early in the morning, jarring me from restless thoughts that had lingered all night. I hesitated for a moment before answering. His voice came through, smooth and familiar. "Jessica, your phone was out of reach," he said, the tone almost concerned. "I came by last night, but you weren't home. I returned to the hotel around 11. I tried to steady my voice. "Yes, I was busy at the bar. I got back late." There was a pause before he asked, "Why didn't you call me?" "I was caught up with work," I said, trying to keep the conversation short. "Are you all right?" he pressed. "Yes, everything's fine," I assured him, though I couldn't help but notice how easy it was for me to lie. "Well, I'm coming home now," Edward said, his voice warm with an edge of finality. "I want to spend some time with you." I barely had time to prepare before he arrived. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a strange mix of dread and guilt swirling through me. The door swung open, and there he was, his polished demeanor intact as always. He leaned in and kissed me deeply, murmuring, "Darling, I missed you." "I missed you too," I replied, though my voice lacked conviction. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. "Get dressed," he said with a grin. "We're going out to see a movie." I nodded and went to change, my mind racing. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Samuel. His touch, his smell, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. Even as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my dress, it was his face I saw in my mind. At the theater, Edward was cheerful, making small talk about his business as we found our seats. But my attention drifted. For a moment, I swore I saw Samuel sitting just a few seats away, smiling at me. My breath caught, but when I blinked again, he was gone. "What's wrong?" Edward asked, his voice pulling me back to reality. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. The movie passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on the screen, and my thoughts kept circling back to Samuel. On the drive home, Edward's phone buzzed, and he answered without hesitation. It was her, the woman I'd seen him with at the hotel. "I'll be there soon," he said smoothly, his tone professional but unmistakably familiar. I stared at him, my expression hardening. He didn't even bother to explain. "I have to leave," he said after hanging up. "Work calls, but I'll see you tomorrow." I didn't bother replying as he drove off. When I returned home, I found Samuel waiting for me. He was leaning against the doorway, his presence filling the space effortlessly. "What are you doing here?" I asked, startled. "How did you even get in?" "I broke the window," he said with a smirk, his voice soft but determined. "I couldn't stay away." "Samuel, you can't just do this," I said, exasperated. "I told you, I don't love you. I can't." "All right," he said, his expression unreadable. "Then I'll go." He turned to leave, but something in me broke. I couldn't fight it anymore. Before I knew it, I rushed toward him, grabbing his arm. His scent, warm, earthy, intoxicating, pulled me in, and I kissed him. It wasn't planned, but it felt inevitable. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of sheets as Samuel drew closer to me. His touch was gentle, his fingers brushing my cheek before he leaned in to kiss me deeply. His lips lingered on my neck, warm and deliberate, as his hands traced my back with care. Each kiss carried a tenderness that made me feel cherished. He moved lower, planting gentle kisses along my collarbone, his movements unhurried, as if savoring every moment. I felt my heart swell, the connection deepening with every touch. That night was a blur of passion and longing. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The next morning, I woke to find Samuel propped on his elbow, watching me with a soft smile. "Samuel, I need to tell you something," I began, my voice hesitant. His brow furrowed. "What is it?" I took a deep breath. "I'm married." His expression hardened instantly. "What the hell? You're married?" "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I should have told you sooner. My husband, he's been unfaithful. Our marriage has been over for a long time, but I was too scared to let go." He stood up, running a hand through his hair. "Jessica, this isn't something you can just drop on me. You have to choose. Me or him." "I need time," I pleaded. He shook his head, grabbing his shirt. "Take all the time you need, but don't expect me to wait forever." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that made my chest ache. Later that day, nausea hit me like a freight train. I rushed to the bathroom, my stomach churning. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. Could I be pregnant? To be sure, I bought a pregnancy test. The result was undeniable. 2 bright lines stared back at me. My hands trembled as I set the test down. I had Samuel's child. I found Edward at his hotel and told him the truth. "Edward, I'm pregnant," I said, keeping my voice steady. His face lit up with joy. "Jessica, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for us." "It's not your child," I said quietly, cutting through his excitement. The room fell silent. "What?" he said, his voice sharp. "This isn't funny." "I'm serious," I said firmly. "I love someone else, and I want a divorce." He stared at me, his expression a mix of shock and anger. "Jessica, we can work through this. I love you. I'll take time off, and we can start over." "No, Edward," I said, my voice unwavering. "I've seen you with her. I know what you've been doing." "That's not true," he protested, his tone defensive. "You must be mistaken." I shook my head. "I'm not. This is over." Filing for divorce was easier than I expected. In the courtroom, Edward made one last attempt to sway me, his words rehearsed and insincere. But I stood my ground. Later, I met Samuel. When I told him I was free, his reaction was cautious. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. "I'm sure," I said, taking his hand. "I've made my choice." He smiled, pulling me into a kiss. "Then let's start over. Together." I agreed, but asked for time to process everything. Samuel understood, his patience a reminder of why I had fallen for him in the first place. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking toward something real, something worth fighting for. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. Samuel and I had slipped into a routine that felt like a perfect dream. He would meet me at the bar, his warm smile lighting up the room, and we'd return home together, sharing meals and stolen moments of laughter. Each night, he held me close, his presence a balm to the wounds I had thought would never heal. But that morning, as I woke to a sharp pain in my lower abdomen, everything changed. My instincts told me it was time. I called Samuel, my voice trembling as I explained. He didn't waste a second. Within minutes, he was by my side at the hospital. Hours later, I held our baby girl in my arms, her tiny fingers curling around mine. Samuel's eyes shimmered with joy, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt complete. That night, exhausted yet elated, I fell into a deep sleep, but my dreams betrayed me. Diago appeared, his dark, enigmatic figure looming like a shadow over my joy. "You've achieved your dreams," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But now, you must pay the price." "What do you mean?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "You must sacrifice your most beloved one," he said. I woke up gasping, the remnants of the dream clinging to me like cobwebs. The room was quiet, Samuel sleeping peacefully beside me, our daughter swaddled in her crib. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I told Samuel about the dream, hoping he'd brush it off as nonsense. Instead, he took my hand, his expression serious. "Nothing will happen to her," he promised, his voice steady. "I'll protect both of you." His reassurance helped, but the fear stayed with me. I stopped going to the bar, dedicating every moment to my daughter. I watched her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling, her innocence a stark contrast to the dark thoughts that plagued me. One afternoon, I decided to take her for a walk in the park. That's when I saw her, Hannah. She was sitting on a bench, her elegance impossible to miss. Anger and curiosity propelled me forward. "So you're his girlfriend now?" I asked, my voice sharp. Hannah looked up, startled. "What are you talking about, Jessica? You're Hannah, right? Edward's business partner?" "Yes," she said slowly, her brows furrowing. "I saw you," I said, my words cutting through the air. "In bed with my husband that night." Her expression softened, and to my surprise, she didn't deny it. "I was there, yes, but not in the way you think. My husband was in the same room. We were discussing business, Jessica, that's all." I froze, her words hitting me like a brick. "You're lying." "I'm not," she said firmly. "I love my husband. We have 2 kids. Ask him if you don't believe me." Doubt seeped into my thoughts, unraveling the certainty I had carried for so long. "You mean to say there was nothing between you and Edward?" "Nothing," she said. "Edward always loved you, Jessica. He talked about you constantly." I couldn't breathe. The weight of her words pressed down on me, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. Had I thrown everything away based on a misunderstanding? But it was too late. I loved Samuel. My life was with him now. That evening, I didn't tell Samuel about my meeting with Hannah, but he noticed my silence. "Are you okay, my love?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm just scared," I admitted. "For her." "She's safe," he said, wrapping his arms around me. "I'll make sure of it." The next morning, I woke to find the bed empty beside me. Panic set in as I searched the house. Then I saw them. Samuel playing with our daughter in the living room, her giggles filling the air. Relief washed over me, and I leaned against the doorway, watching them. He noticed me and smiled. "I'm taking her to the park. Come with us?" "I need a quick bath," I said, returning his smile. "I'll join you soon." They left, and I hurried through my routine. But as I was getting ready, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" I answered. "Jessica?" The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Edward. I froze, the sound of his voice pulling me back to a life I thought I had left behind. "Yes, Edward." "I don't want to bother you," he began, "but this is important. I had a strange dream last night. There was a man in a forest. He said I had to sacrifice my beloved." A chill ran through me. "He said that to you?" "Yes," Edward said. "I thought you should know, especially since I heard you had a baby girl recently." My breath caught. My hands trembled. "Edward, I think this child is yours." "What are you talking about?" His disbelief was palpable. "I'll explain," I said quickly. "Meet me at Daniel Child Park." When I arrived at the park, Samuel and our daughter were nowhere to be found. My eyes darted around the park, scanning for Samuel's familiar figure and the little stroller. Anxiety clawed at my chest as I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Samuel, where are you? Call me back!" I pleaded into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. My mind raced. What if something had happened? What if this was the beginning of the sacrifice Diago had spoken of? I couldn't let myself spiral. Taking a deep breath, I focused. I couldn't lose her. Not now. I began searching the park, weaving through the winding paths and clusters of trees, calling their names. People stared at me, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern, but I didn't care. I shifted instinctively, my heightened senses in werewolf form allowing me to pick up faint traces of their scent. My heart settled slightly. It was recent. I followed the trail through the edge of the park into the nearby forest, but it disappeared. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't adding up. Panic surged again as I retraced my steps, desperate for any sign of them. When I finally returned to the park's entrance, defeated and confused, my phone rang. It was Edward.
"Jessica, where are you?"
he asked, urgency in his tone. I don't know," I stammered. "I can't find Samuel or the baby. They were supposed to be here." "Calm down. I'm almost at the park. We'll figure this out together," he said firmly. Hearing his voice soothed me, if only a little. I hung up and waited nervously as my thoughts spiraled. What if I had misjudged Samuel? Could he be hiding something from me? Or was this all just a cruel coincidence? When Edward arrived, his expression was a mix of concern and confusion. He looked at me carefully, like he was searching for answers in my face.
"Jessica, start from the beginning," he said,
his voice steady but firm. I took a shaky breath. "Samuel took the baby to the park. I told him I'd join them after a bath, but when I got here, they were gone. I called him, but he's not answering." Edward rubbed the back of his neck, his jaw tightening. "Did he mention where he might go? Anything out of the ordinary?" "No," I said, my voice trembling. "We've been happy. Or so I thought." Edward glanced around the park, his eyes narrowing as if he could piece together the puzzle just by standing there. "Jessica, listen. We'll find her. I promise." I wanted to believe him, but fear still gripped me. We decided to check my house. Edward followed me back, and I braced myself for what I might, or might not, find. As soon as I opened the door, relief flooded me. There they were. Samuel sat on the floor with our baby girl in his arms, her laughter filling the room. He looked up, startled, when he saw me. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Samuel frowned. "I was here. She started fussing in the park, so I brought her back home. I didn't have my phone to call you." I froze, my emotions swirling in a mess of confusion, anger, and relief. "You should have told me," I said quietly. He stood, holding the baby close.
"I didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted to keep her comfortable."
Edward stepped into the doorway then, his presence heavy in the air. Samuel's eyes flicked to him, his brows furrowing.
"What's he doing here?"
Samuel asked, his voice low. Before I could answer, Edward spoke.
"We need to talk. All of us."
Samuel's grip on the baby tightened slightly. "About what?" I swallowed hard, my gaze bouncing between the two men. Edward had a dream. The same one I did. I stood by the door, the tension in the room high as Samuel asked the question I had dreaded. "Why did you ask Edward to come here?" His voice was calm, but I could hear the disappointment lurking beneath it. I shifted on my feet, unable to meet his gaze directly. "Samuel, I needed to tell him the truth," I said softly. "The child. She's his. He deserves to know." His jaw tightened.
"It doesn't matter," he said firmly. "She might be his biologically, but I'm her father. I've been here for her, and I'll always be here for her. Nothing changes that."
I felt a small wave of relief at his words. Samuel's love for our daughter was pure, and I knew he meant every word. But the look in his eyes told me I had hurt him by bringing Edward into our home. "I know, Samuel," I said. "I know how much she means to you, but Edward has a right to meet her." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before sighing and walking toward the bedroom.
"I won't let anyone take her from me,"
he said quietly, with our daughter in his arms. The silence he left behind was suffocating. Edward shifted uncomfortably in the living room, his hands tucked into his pockets. I turned to face him, forcing a calm I didn't feel.
This child is yours, I said plainly. Tell me, Edward, what do you want now? Before Edward could answer, Samuel's voice cut through the air like a blade. Edward, nice to meet you, but let's get one thing straight. This child is mine. I won't let you take her away, is that clear? Samuel, I exclaimed, my voice sharp. You can't talk like that. Without another word, Samuel disappeared into the bedroom, locking the door behind him. Edward sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Jessica, I don't want to cause any trouble. How about we work something out? Maybe we could share custody? I take her for a week, then you take her the next? The suggestion made me pause. That could work, I admitted hesitantly. But she's still so young. She needs me for breastfeeding right now. Maybe when she's a bit older. Edward nodded thoughtfully. Of course. I didn't think about that. But for now, could I at least spend some time with her here? Just for today? I hesitated again, but his request felt reasonable. All right, I said, offering a small smile. You can stay for a while. Edward's face softened with gratitude. Thank you. It means a lot. I led him to the sofa and went to the bedroom to talk to Samuel. I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, holding our daughter close. His expression was distant, and it broke my heart. Samuel, I began gently. I know this is hard for you, but Edward has the right to spend some time with her. He's her father. Samuel didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with a quiet storm. Listen, I continued, sitting beside him. Edward isn't taking her. She'll stay here until she's older and doesn't need to be breastfed. Today is just a visit. That's all. Samuel finally spoke, his voice low. You're letting him stay here? With us? Don't you think that's a little awkward for me? I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. I know it's uncomfortable, I said softly. But it's just one day. Please, for me? He let out a bitter laugh. Do I have any other choice? Fine. One day. I didn't push further. Instead, I convinced him to come out and face Edward. When we returned to the living room, Edward looked up, his eyes immediately drawn to the baby in Samuel's arms. Samuel, Edward said, keeping his tone respectful. Would it be all right if I held her for a bit? Samuel handed her over with hesitation, but his words were laced with bitterness. She's your child, after all. I'm just the third wheel here. Samuel, stop, I said firmly, but Edward quickly diffused the tension. It's all right, Jessica, he said, cradling the baby gently. I understand where he's coming from. Samuel didn't reply. He walked toward the bathroom, closing the door behind him. I took a deep breath and went to the kitchen to prepare lunch. As I chopped vegetables, I heard Edward enter the room behind me. Jessica, he began, his voice softer now. Do you ever miss us? What we had? I froze for a moment before turning to face him. Edward, please, I said, keeping my voice steady. You know I'm with Samuel now. Even if I did miss you, it doesn't matter. That chapter is closed. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. So you do miss me, he said quietly. I've missed you every day, Jessica. I've wished 1,000 times that we could go back. Before I could react, he leaned in and kissed me. His lips were firm, familiar, and for a brief moment, I was lost in the memories of us. But then reality crashed over me. I pulled away, my heart racing. Edward, no, I said firmly, stepping back. This isn't right. I love Samuel. This This can't happen. Edward looked down, his expression filled with regret. I'm sorry, he murmured. I had to know if you still felt something. Before I could respond, Samuel's voice called from the living room. Edward quickly left the kitchen, carrying the baby back to the sofa. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady myself. This was too much. Too many emotions. Too much confusion. When I returned to the living room, Samuel was putting on his jacket. He kissed me on the forehead, his lips lingering just a moment too long as his eyes flickered toward Edward. This is our child, he whispered so low only I could hear. Take care of her until I'm back. He straightened and left for the bar without another word, leaving me standing there, caught between two worlds. I was sitting on the floor, playing with my daughter, her tiny fingers gripping mine as she giggled softly. The moment was tender, the kind that makes you forget the chaos in life, if only for a second. Edward sat across the room, watching us, a strange expression on his face. I wasn't sure if it was longing or guilt, but it unsettled me. He cleared his throat. Jessica, about earlier. I looked up sharply. Edward, never do that again. I'm with Samuel now. I love him, and you need to respect that. He held up his hands as if in surrender. Okay, I understand. It won't happen again. I didn't respond, focusing instead on my baby. She was my anchor in moments like this, her innocence reminding me of what truly mattered. Can I hold her? Edward asked, his tone careful, almost hesitant. I hesitated for just a beat, then handed her over. Sure, be gentle. He cradled her in his arms and began making silly faces, eliciting a series of happy squeals from her. I watched them interact, part of me wishing this could be simpler, wishing we could all just coexist without the shadow of the past hanging over us. So, Edward said after a while, glancing toward the kitchen. What's for dinner? I pushed myself up from the floor. I'll figure something out, I said, brushing off my jeans as I headed toward the kitchen. The smell of garlic filled the small space as I started chopping vegetables. The quiet of the house struck me then, and I realized I couldn't hear my baby's giggles anymore, or Edward's voice. My chest tightened. Something was off. Edward, I called, wiping my hands on a dish towel and stepping out of the kitchen. The living room was empty. My daughter's blanket was on the floor, and Edward's coat was missing from the chair. Panic surged through me like a jolt of electricity. I rushed to the front door, throwing it open, and saw nothing but the quiet street. Grabbing my phone, I dialed Samuel. Jessica, what's wrong? His voice was immediately alert. The baby, she's gone. Edward's gone. I think he took her. My voice cracked as I spoke, fear gripping me. I'm on my way, Samuel said. I couldn't wait. Every second felt like an eternity. I grabbed my coat and keys and ran out the door, heading straight for Edward's house. When I arrived, it was eerily silent. I pounded on the door, calling his name, but there was no answer. Peering through the window, I saw the house was empty, like no one had lived there for days. My heart sank. Frustration bubbled inside me, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. There was one other place he could be. The woods. The air grew colder as I entered the forest, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. My boots crunched against the fallen leaves, and I called out Edward's name, my voice echoing in the vast emptiness. Then, through the trees, I saw a faint glow. My steps quickened, the light guiding me deeper into the woods. When I finally reached the clearing, my breath caught. Edward stood in the middle, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in the dirt. He held my daughter in one arm, and in the other, a small, ornate box. Well, he said with a smirk, turning to face me. You found me, but you're too late. My voice shook with anger. What the hell are you doing with our child? He tilted his head, his smile growing. Our child? No, Jessica. Your child. What does that even mean? I demanded, taking a cautious step closer. Edward's expression darkened, and his voice dropped to a mocking whisper. It's not my child, Jessica. It's Samuel's. His words hit me like a slap. What are you talking about? I never saw any dreams, Edward said, his tone dripping with disdain. I knew you did. I planned it all. That box, this box, was always the goal, but it requires a sacrifice. I needed someone foolish enough to fall in love with me, someone willing to give up everything for a wish, and that was you. The realization crashed over me, leaving me breathless, my hands clenched into fists. You used me, I said through gritted teeth, anger replacing the shock. Before I could do anything, a rustling sound came from the trees, and a figure stepped into the clearing. My stomach dropped when I saw her. Anna? I asked, disbelief lacing my voice. What are you doing here? She smiled, her eyes gleaming with malice. Because I love Edward. Remember that day in the bathroom? That was him with me. I've been with him all along. My mind reeled, pieces of the past snapping into place. So it was you two. I should have known. Anna shrugged, stepping closer to Edward. And yet, here we are. I let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. You know, Anna, Edward isn't exactly the faithful type. Did you know he's been sleeping with his business partner? A woman, of course. You weren't his only fling. Anna's smile faltered, and she turned to Edward. What is she talking about? Edward's eyes darted between us. I don't know what she's trying to pull. Don't listen to her, Anna. I only love you. Sure you do, I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. I have proof, Anna. I can show you if you want. Anna's face twisted with doubt and anger. Edward? She asked, her voice sharper now. I swear she's lying, he protested. Edward's voice had risen to a desperate pitch. Anna, please don't believe her. She's just trying to turn you against me. You know I love you. Anna crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. Do you? Because it sure doesn't sound like it. If there's even a shred of truth to what she's saying— There's not, Edward interrupted, his tone sharp. Jessica is lying. She'll say anything to tear us apart. I stood silently, my eyes darting between the two of them, the scene playing out exactly as I'd hoped. Edward was sweating now, his confidence cracking like a brittle shell. Anna's expression was harder to read. Disappointment, anger, confusion. It was all there, swirling in her gaze as she stared at him. You told me I was the only one, Anna said, her voice trembling slightly. You said I was special. You are, Edward exclaimed, taking a step toward her. Anna, you're the only one I've ever loved. I swear it. Then why does she sound so convincing? Anna shot back, her voice growing louder. Why do I feel like an idiot standing here? Edward reached out to touch her arm, but Anna pulled away sharply. Don't, she hissed. It was time. Their argument had given me the opening I needed. My fingers twitched, and the primal energy inside me surged. I let it take over, my body shifting seamlessly into my werewolf form. My senses sharpened instantly, the scent of the damp earth, the sound of Edward's erratic breathing, even the faint rustle of Anna's coat as she stepped back in surprise. Before Edward could react, I lunged. My claws raked across his chest, and he stumbled backward, falling to the ground with a thud.
A cry of pain escaped his lips as I stood over him, my growl low and menacing. "Jessica, stop!" he shouted, his hands raised defensively. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my child, my family, everything Edward had threatened. I swiped at him again, my claws slicing through fabric and flesh. Blood stained the ground beneath him, the metallic scent filling the air. Edward writhed beneath me, trying to push me off, but I was faster, stronger. He had no time to shift, no chance to fight back. Every time he moved, I was already there, blocking him, striking him. "Jessica!" Anna's voice cut through the chaos, but I barely registered it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her standing frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. "Anna, help me!" Edward shouted, his voice breaking. But Anna didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her eyes darting between us. I could see the conflict written all over her face. If Edward had betrayed her, why should she save him? Why risk herself for someone who had lied to her? She hesitated, her indecision palpable, and I took advantage of it. My claws sank into Edward's shoulder, pinning him down as he let out a strangled cry. His hands flailed, searching for something, anything, to fight back with. But the dirt offered him no reprieve. Anna's gaze shifted to me, then back to Edward. Her lips pressed together tightly, and for a moment I thought she might step in. But she didn't. She stayed where she was, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Edward's voice was hoarse now, desperate. "Anna, please! Don't just stand there! Help me!" Still, she didn't move. Her silence spoke volumes. She was watching, waiting, trying to decide what mattered more, her loyalty to Edward, or the truth she'd just uncovered. The moment Anna shifted into her vampire form, I knew it was going to get worse. Her skin turned a pale, almost translucent white, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural, fiery intensity. She let out a hiss as sharp fangs appeared, her movements quick and lethal. She was ready to finish what Edward had started. Edward, seeing his chance, didn't hesitate. His muscles rippled as his body morphed into his werewolf form, fur sprouting across his skin, claws elongating. The transformation was swift, but it was enough to give him the power he'd need. Both of them were now predators, and I was their prey. I wasn't stupid. I knew I was outmatched. Anna's vampire strength and Edward's werewolf power, together, they were unstoppable. But for my child, for the one thing that kept me grounded, I was ready to fight with everything I had. I wasn't going down without a fight. Anna lunged at me first, her speed almost too much to follow. Her claws raked at my skin, but I managed to twist out of the way, the pain sharp but fleeting. I countered with a swipe of my own, but she dodged it easily. "You're too slow," she sneered, her voice cold, venomous. Then Edward came at me from the side, his massive form charging with all the force of a freight train. He slammed into me, knocking the air out of my lungs. I fell hard against the ground, my mind racing. If I didn't get up soon, this would be it. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking, but I couldn't give up. For my child, I couldn't let them win. I lashed out, my claws digging into Edward's side as I caught him off guard. He howled in pain, but the wound wasn't enough to slow him down. He retaliated, slashing at my face. I felt the sting, but I didn't care. I couldn't let this be the end. But I knew. This fight couldn't last long. Both of them together were too much. I needed a way to gain the upper hand, to give myself even a second of time. And that's when I heard it. The sound of feet crunching on the forest floor. It was Samuel. I turned my head just in time to see him running toward me. My heart skipped, but fear gnawed at me.
Samuel was human. He had no business being here, no way to fight them. Still, he kept coming, his face set with determination. "Samuel, no!" I shouted. But he didn't listen. He attacked Edward, throwing himself at the beast with all the strength he could muster. Edward was taken off guard for a second, stumbling back as Samuel tried to land a blow. But it didn't take long for Edward to regain his footing, and within moments, Samuel was knocked to the ground, his body slamming into the dirt with a sickening thud. I was relieved. For just a second, I had the time I needed to face Anna alone. The moment Edward hit the ground, I saw it. An opening. Anna, standing off to the side, looked caught off guard by his sudden defeat. She glanced between him and me, the tension building in the air. I didn't care about that, though. My focus was singular. My child needed me, and I wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of protecting them. I rushed at Anna, moving faster than I thought possible. She reacted quickly, but I was faster. Before she could dodge, I had her pinned to the ground, my grip tight. She struggled beneath me, but I was fueled by a force she couldn't comprehend. I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting for my family. Anna tried to twist out of my hold, her eyes flashing with frustration, but each move she made, I anticipated. She was strong, no doubt, but she wasn't as strong as I was right now. I could feel the power surging through me, and with each strike, I knocked her back further, until she was lying stunned in the dirt. "Stay down," I said, voice low but firm. She hissed, clearly enraged, but the fight had left her eyes. She was done. I took a deep breath, and that's when I noticed Samuel. He was still trying to fight off Edward, but it was clear he was getting overpowered. Edward had recovered, his werewolf strength overwhelming Samuel's human form. My heart dropped into my stomach. I wanted to rush over, but I couldn't afford to, not with Anna still a threat. I glanced at Samuel, who was struggling to stay on his feet, blood dripping down his face. Edward was forcing him down, but Samuel wouldn't give up. Not without a fight. "No!" I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. I turned to face Edward, knowing I had no time to waste. He was already preparing to strike again. This wasn't going to be easy, but I had no choice. I was going to stop him, no matter what. I barely had time to react as Edward lunged toward me, claws outstretched. But this time, I was ready. I ducked under his swipe, barely avoiding his claws, and countered with a strike of my own. My claws scraped across his side, drawing blood. Edward howled in pain, but he didn't slow down. He was too strong, too determined to win. I kept fighting, each blow fueled by the need to protect Samuel, to protect my child. Edward may have been powerful, but I wasn't backing down. I swung at him again and again, determined to bring him down. Edward faltered, stumbling back. I pressed the attack, pushing harder, my movements quick and precise. He tried to recover, but I was relentless. With one final strike, I knocked him off his feet, sending him sprawling to the ground. But I didn't have time to breathe. Samuel was still struggling, lying on the ground, barely conscious. I rushed to his side, my heart in my throat. "Samuel, no," I whispered, my voice breaking as I touched his bloodied face. His chest rose and fell, shallow and slow. He was still alive, but barely. He opened his eyes, a weak smile forming on his lips. "I'm here. I'll always be here," he murmured. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Edward was already getting back up, and I knew I couldn't let him recover. Not now. I turned to face him, my body aching from the battle, but my resolve stronger than ever. He wouldn't take my family. Not now. Not ever. Edward's eyes locked on me, his expression twisted with anger. He lunged again, but this time, he was slower, weaker. His injuries from the fight had taken their toll. I met his attack head-on, my own strength. As I stood over Edward, my heart was heavy in my chest. I could feel the exhaustion in every part of my body, but there was no time to rest. I glanced quickly at Samuel, who was still struggling to keep his eyes open, his body barely able to stay upright. I dropped to my knees beside him, gently cupping his face in my hands. His bruised and bloodied features made my heart ache. "Samuel, please, stay with me," I whispered, my voice trembling. His eyes flickered open for a moment, that familiar warmth returning to them, though barely. "I'm here," he said, his voice soft but steady, despite the pain he was in. "I told you, I'd always be here." Tears welled up in my eyes as I pressed my forehead to his. My heart ached with a mix of relief and sorrow. It was over. This nightmare had come to an end. Edward was down, and Anna, though still unconscious, was no longer a threat. But the weight of what had just happened hung heavily in the air. I could feel the weight of the moment on my shoulders, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. But for now, there was only the relief of knowing my family was safe. I looked over at Edward one more time. He lay on the ground, motionless. His eyes were closed, the battle finally over. There was a part of me that felt vindicated for everything he had put us through, but there was also a sadness. He had once been a part of my life, and now he was just a shadow of that man. I held my child close, feeling the warmth of the tiny body against mine, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. Samuel was lying there, on the ground, barely hanging on. The fight was over, but the consequences weighed heavily on all of us. I knew the time we had left was short, but I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I looked at Samuel, his face pale, the pain in his eyes still visible, even though his body was growing weaker with each passing second. "I'm calling an ambulance, Samuel. Don't worry. We'll be together." "I love you," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. Samuel smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching with effort. "You don't need to call an ambulance," he said in a raspy voice. "You know, I'm taking my last breaths. But remember, I'm the father of your child. Doesn't matter who's the biological father. I'll always be her father." I blinked, the tears stinging my eyes. I had spent so much time running from the truth, running from the life I had with Samuel. And yet, here we were, on the edge of something that couldn't be undone. "Samuel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Actually, you are the biological father of my child." His eyes widened, and for a moment, I could see the shock and the overwhelming emotion flooding through him. Tears welled up in his eyes, and I could tell he wasn't sure whether to believe me or not. But when his gaze met mine, I saw something that I hadn't expected. Pure love. He nodded slowly, as though finally understanding, but the pain in his expression was unmistakable. I pulled out my phone and called the ambulance, trying to keep my voice calm. My hands were shaking, but I knew that there was nothing else to do. We needed help. "Forgive me," Samuel whispered after a long pause. "I didn't want to leave you. I never wanted this. But now, I'm—" His voice trailed off as if the words were too heavy to say. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears. "Forgive me, Samuel," I said, my voice cracking. "I thought you were just taking advantage of me when you told me I was pregnant. I wasn't ready. Everything happened so fast, but I know now that you've always loved me." Samuel's eyes softened, and his hand reached out weakly, trembling slightly. "Let me hold my child. Just once." I hesitated, but only for a second. With a careful movement, I placed our child in his arms, and he held her close, his eyes closing as he kissed the baby's tiny forehead. The soft sound of his kiss echoed in the stillness, and I watched as he cherished that brief moment. But then, as I stood there, waiting, something was wrong. Samuel didn't move. The breath that had once been shallow and ragged now stopped altogether. I felt a cold wave wash over me. My body froze, and for a second I couldn't breathe. "Samuel," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Samuel." He didn't answer. His hand dropped from the child's tiny form, and I could feel my heart shatter all over again. I couldn't believe it. I had finally told him everything, and now I had to say goodbye. I held my child close, the tiny body warm against mine, but the tears couldn't stop. I cried for everything we had lost, for the love we never got to share, for the life we could never build together. But mostly, I cried because Samuel wouldn't be there to watch our child grow. He wouldn't be there to teach them, to love them, to be the father I had always dreamed for them. The ambulance arrived soon after, but I barely noticed. They took Samuel's body, and all I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of it all. My arms were full of my child, the last piece of Samuel that I had left. As the ambulance drove away, taking Samuel's body with it, I knew that I had to be strong. For my child. For Samuel. He had given me everything, even though we had both made mistakes along the way. And now, it was my turn to make sure the love we shared lived on, even in the face of all the pain. I wiped my tears, kissed my child's forehead, and whispered, "I love you." And I promised myself that no matter what, I would never forget the man who had loved me, who had fought for me, and who had given me this child. I would carry that love with me always, in every step I took, in every breath I breathed, for as long as I lived.